She was only 12. No weapons. No threats. Just a scared little girl dragged into court in handcuffs for fighting back against a grown white cop. But what no one in that courtroom knew was who her father really was, or what he'd been trained to do when silence became injustice. Would you still call her dangerous once you knew the truth? If that question made you stop and think, hit like, leave a comment, and let's get into the story. The courtroom was already too quiet when the side doors opened. Not even the sound of papers rustling or shoes shifting, just silence, heavy, watching, waiting. And then she appeared. Leona Wells, 12 years old. A thin black girl in a torn school uniform, her wrists locked in cold metal cuffs that were clearly made for someone twice her size. Her sneakers scraped softly against the floor with each reluctant step, guided no pushed by Officer Doyle Brennan, who walked just close enough behind her to make sure she knew who was in charge. People turned to look, but not the way you'd look at a child, not with concern or kindness. Their eyes narrowed, stiffened, as if they were trying to figure out how someone so small could pose such a threat. Judge Barrett Stone, a tall man with graying temples and the voice of a former soldier, leaned forward slightly, observing her like a file on his desk. When Leona glanced up for a moment, his eyes didn't soften. They just scanned her and returned to his notes. The bailiff announced the case, The People versus Leona Wells. Charges include assault on a law enforcement officer and resisting arrest near South End Market. Someone in the back murmured something under their breath, hard to tell whether it was surprise or judgment. Probably both. Leona was placed in the witness stand, the cuffs still on. Her shoulders stiff, but her jaw held steady. Not completely still, her fingers twitched, slightly betraying the storm inside. She wasn't silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because every word was being measured against her. Brennan adjusted his uniform like he was preparing for battle. Then in front of everyone, he asked, "Why were you fighting back, huh? Thought you'd be tough. Thought you'd be." Leona blinked. Her voice was quiet but not timid. "Because he hurt me first." A few eyebrows raised. Not many. Most kept their heads down, either typing notes or pretending they didn't hear what they just heard. Judge Stone didn't ask for clarity. He didn't even pause. Instead, he picked up his gavel and said flatly, "This court demands order. No reprimand for the officer. No pause to ask what Leona meant. Just a child in cuffs and a system moving right past her like she was an inconvenience." And yet she didn't cry. The prosecutor, Ms. Flanagan, leaned toward the microphone and began listing off her charges, her voice crisp, rehearsed, and impersonal, as though she were reading off parking violations. Leona sat still. Brennan smirked. As the accusations were read, no one seemed to wonder how a child could have overpowered a fully grown officer. No one questioned why a 12-year-old would be alone near the market that evening. No one asked why she didn't have a parent with her during booking. Not once. Judge Stone turned to her briefly. "Do you understand the charges brought against you?" Leona nodded. "Do you wish to say anything before we proceed?" She opened her mouth slightly, then stopped herself. Then she spoke, not loud, not angry, but her words came with something deeper than volume, something that stayed in the room after she said it. "He said I looked like trouble," she whispered. "That's all it took." No one responded. Not officially, not with words. But the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. A man in the back crossed his arms tightly, and for just a moment, Judge Stone looked like he might have something to say. But then he looked down again at the paper, not at the girl, and gave a single nod. "Proceed." And just like that, the courtroom moved forward, as if nothing had been broken. As if they hadn't just watched a child confess not to a crime, but to a label she didn't choose, one that had been stamped on her the moment she walked into that market with brown skin and a backpack too big for her frame. But Leona sat still. She didn't squirm. She didn't shout. She just stared at her own hands in those metal cuffs, quietly waiting for someone, anyone, to notice they didn't belong there. It wasn't that Leona stayed quiet. It was that the courtroom was too loud with people who had already made up their minds. Nurse Cynthia Green was the first to take the stand that morning. Her uniform still had a faint crease from the overnight shift. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands kept moving as if trying to shake off the memory. "I was on duty at South End ER that night," she said calmly. "The girl came in with a gash near the back of her head. The officer said she'd resisted arrest, but I asked her what happened and she told me he slammed her down. No warning. Just force. For a moment, something shifted in the room, but not for long. The prosecutor, Ms. Flanagan, barely let the words land before rising. Objection, Your Honor. That's hearsay and lacks legal relevance. Judge Stone didn't hesitate. Objection sustained. Ms. Green, please keep your comments to observable facts, not impressions. Green paused. Her lips tightened, but she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But as she stepped down, she looked at Leona just once, and something in her face, guilt, maybe seemed to say what the courtroom would not. Next came Clara Hayes, Leona's English teacher. Mid-30s, soft-spoken, and clearly nervous. She clutched a folder full of student essays that would never be read aloud here. I've known Leona since 4th grade she began, and she's not a violent child. She's thoughtful, quiet, yes, but curious and kind. She writes stories about her mother. Ms. Hayes Flanagan cut in sharply. We're not here for character endorsements. This isn't a parent-teacher conference. Stone nodded. Sustained. Please keep your remarks within legal boundaries. Clara blinked, stunned. But this is about who she is, isn't it? Silence. And then Flanagan answered flat and cold. Emotions don't belong in this courtroom. The words didn't echo, but they landed like a slap. Leona sat through it all, hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't look down. She didn't cry. But her eyes never stopped watching the adults stumble over the truth, watching every person who tried to defend her get shut down like they were making too much noise in church. When her teacher walked past her on the way out, Leona whispered something not even loud enough for the mic to pick up. But Clara stopped, swallowed hard, and kept walking. Then it was Leona's turn to speak, for the first time. Stone looked at her, brow raised as if already bracing for something inconvenient. Ms. Wells, he said, you may respond if you wish. Leona took a breath. One slow breath. And then she looked around the room. Not at Brennan. Not even at the judge. She looked at the jurors, then at Flanagan, and finally back at Stone. And then she said it. Quiet, steady. You'd listen to me if I looked like your granddaughter. There was no gasp, no chaos, just a beat of absolute stillness. Even Judge Stone didn't move for a second. His gavel stayed resting on the bench. His hand just hovered there, undecided. And for the first time in that room, Leona didn't feel small because of the cuffs or the whispers. She felt small because everyone had worked so hard not to see her at all. Not as a child, not as a human, not as someone whose voice should matter. And still she spoke anyway. That was the moment the audience watching the trial began to shift in their seats. Not because of outrage, not because of pity, but because something about the way she said it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a wound they'd all been trained to ignore. He didn't yell. He didn't sneer. Judge Barrett Stone didn't need to raise his voice because the weight of his silence was enough to freeze a room. To many, he looked like justice itself. Upright posture, silver hair, always neat black robe, sharp at the shoulders. But there was something behind his stillness, something older than this courtroom, colder than the marble beneath their feet. Barrett Stone had served before he ever judged. A soldier once, respected, feared, and then bereaved. His son had died in a war far from here. A son he'd raised to follow orders and stand tall just like him. The folded flag sat in a glass case above his fireplace, but what really stayed with him was the silence that followed. Not just grief, but the brutal truth that even control couldn't protect what you loved. So when the media tore him apart years later for ruling in favor of a white officer in a police misconduct case, Stone didn't lash out. He simply withdrew, not from the bench, but from empathy. He told himself emotions only cloud the law, and from that point on, he made sure his courtroom had no space for them. In his private chambers, away from the audience, he once told his clerk, "These kids today, they all think they're victims. You hold them accountable, and they call it cruelty." He didn't say it angrily. He said it like someone repeating a rule that had served him well. His clerk didn't argue. No one ever did. Back in court, the air was tight with tension. Leona Wells was called again to speak. Her small figure walked toward the stand with steps careful, but not cowardly. Her school shirt was still torn, her wrists still marked from the cuffs. She had the face of a child, but the room didn't see a child. They saw a problem, a disruption, a risk. Stone watched her closely, not with malice, but with that unshakable lens of legal detachment. Flanagan fired her questions. Brennan stood confidently, his arms crossed, jaw tense. Then it happened subtle quick. As Leona stepped down from the stand, Officer Brennan reached for her arm, not to help, but to control. His hand gripped too tightly, his movement too swift. Leona flinched. She didn't cry out. She didn't stumble. But her body recoiled instinctively, and that was enough. Stone saw it. Just for a moment his eyes flickered. The kind of flicker that betrays a crack in stone. A memory. A question. A ghost. Was it his son he saw for a split second? Or a truth he'd spent years refusing to look directly at? But the flicker passed. Just as quickly as it came, he blinked, and it was gone. He straightened, placed both hands on the bench, and said almost to himself, "We don't bend the law for feelings." Then louder as if to the room, but really to no one in particular. "Because if we do, we lose everything." And just like that, the wall went back up, smooth, unbreakable, cold. But for those who had noticed, even briefly, something had shifted. It was the teacher who brought the papers in. A small stack of lined notebook sheets, creased and smoky at the edges, as if they'd survived something far worse than a school backpack. Clara Hayes, 5th grade homeroom teacher, asked permission to read from one of them. Her voice was even, but the way she held the papers with 2 hands and a trembling thumb said this wasn't just an assignment. "This," she said gently, "is a writing prompt Leona submitted last month. The topic was, 'What do you fear at night?'" She looked down at the page. Her lips moved silently once, maybe twice, like she was trying to prepare herself before letting the words out. "I fear the smell of smoke," she began. "Not just any smoke. My smoke. The kind that woke me up one night when the kitchen light flickered and my mom screamed for me to crawl." The courtroom, once filled with shuffling papers and rustling suits, went still. Even Flanagan didn't move. They said it was faulty wiring. But I saw the man. I saw him standing outside 2 nights before. Watching. I thought he was lost. My mom said not to worry. But the next night, she was the one who didn't make it out. Hayes stopped. Her voice had caught somewhere deep in her chest. Judge Stone leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped the wood once, then twice. Finally, he spoke. "Is this trauma testimony?" "Because this is not a therapy session, Miss Hayes." She folded the paper carefully as if it were something sacred. "No, Your Honor," she replied. "It's just a child's words." Flanagan stood without being prompted. "Then it's inadmissible. Emotional narratives don't belong in legal proceedings." Leona was quiet for a moment. She had been watching the paper more than the people, but when Flanagan's words echoed in the room, she looked up. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't break, but it cut through the silence like something old and sharp. "I still sleep with a flashlight," she said. Flanagan turned. "Excuse me." "I said," Leona repeated, "I still sleep with a flashlight. Every night. Under the blanket. Close to my chest. Does that sound like someone who feels safe to you?" No one answered. She looked straight ahead. Her eyes weren't teary, but there was a weight behind them. The kind of weight that doesn't beg for pity but dares you to dismiss it. "I don't care if you think it's emotional," she said. "It's what happened. It's still happening. Just because I don't scream doesn't mean I'm fine." You could feel it, not just hear it, feel it. Something in the room shifted. Not loudly, not all at once. But the jury leaned in just a little. A few spectators looked down. Even the bailiff, who'd barely blinked since the start of the hearing, pressed his lips together. For the first time, Leona wasn't just the girl in handcuffs or the file on the desk. She was a 12-year-old trying to hold her world together with a flashlight and a memory she couldn't shake. And while Judge Stone said nothing, didn't flinch, didn't react, there was a longer pause before he moved on. Long enough for people to wonder what it must feel like to live in a body that small and carry that much fear every single night. Leona didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't need it. What she needed was someone to stop pretending that silence meant peace. It happened quietly. No doors slammed. No footsteps echoed. Just the soft shuffle of a chair pulling back in the rear of the courtroom, as if someone had been sitting there longer than anyone noticed or had just arrived when no one was looking. A man stood near the back alone. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned. He wore a simple gray dress shirt tucked into charcoal slacks. No tie, no badge, nothing official about him. And yet, something was different. He didn't lean on the wall. He didn't cross his arms. He stood straight, calm hands in front of him, fingers closed around a ring of keys that hung loosely by his side, the kind of keys that looked old, Used. At the end of the ring, dangling barely in sight, was a weathered metal tag with a faded seal etched into it. Most wouldn't recognize it. But if you had worked in intelligence, or around it, you'd know that logo didn't belong to any public agency. Flanagan didn't see him. Judge Stone didn't glance back. But Brennan did. At first, just a passing glance. Then a second look, a squint. He leaned toward the bailiff and whispered, "That guy looks Langley familiar." The bailiff didn't answer. But something about the man's stillness was making people uneasy. Not in the way that screams danger, but in the way silence can hum with a presence too heavy to ignore. Leona hadn't noticed at first. She had been clutching the edges of the seat, still trying to stay calm after sharing her story. But then maybe it was a shift in the air, or maybe it was instinct. She turned her head. And there he was. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. It was more subtle than that, like a child catching sight of a dream they thought they'd stopped believing in. Her lips parted slightly. One hand rose just a bit, as if reaching before she could stop herself. She didn't say his name. Just a quiet question, barely audible, like the words were shaped more in her heart than her throat. "Is that my dad?" No one answered. The man didn't move, didn't nod, didn't blink. But he did squeeze the keys once softly and then let them fall against his leg with a light clink. The sound was small, but it landed like a message. He was here. He wasn't walking away. Leona's shoulders straightened, just a little. The courtroom kept moving. Another witness was called. A legal point was debated. But no one could fully ignore the shift. Something had changed. The man in gray never spoke. He never approached the bench. But his presence began to cast a shadow that reached farther than the front row. Even Judge Stone, though he never turned his head, began to pause longer between statements. His gavel sat untouched for minutes at a time, and when Brennan glanced back again, his posture was different, less smug, more cautious. Because whether anyone knew his name or not, whether they understood what that keychain meant or not, one thing was clear. That man didn't come to watch. He came for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was only just beginning to unfold. The room had quieted, but it wasn't peace, it was pressure. The kind that builds when the truth is hanging in the air and no one wants to reach for it. Leona was back in the witness chair. This time her feet didn't swing. They stayed flat against the wooden rung below, stiff like she was trying to hold herself together from the ground up. The prosecutor stood with arms crossed, flipping through papers like they were weapons. Then came the question, calculated clean. "If you weren't resisting, Ms. Wells," she asked, "why didn't you stay still?" There was no objection, no soft voice cutting in to protect the child in the chair. Just that silence again, waiting to see if a 12-year-old could answer like an adult. Leona looked down first. Her hands clasped in her lap were shaking, but not from fear. From the weight of being told again and again that her truth wasn't good enough unless it matched theirs. Her voice, when it came, was small, but it didn't need volume. "When someone calls you dangerous long enough," she said slowly, "you start to believe them." That line didn't echo off the walls. It sank, like a stone in water. You didn't hear it, you felt it fall. Cynthia Green, the nurse who had testified earlier, wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand. No one had noticed she was still in the room, but now her tears made people notice. She had been the one to clean the blood from Leona's knees, the one to gently hold an ice pack to the girl's temple. But not the one allowed to file a report. That had been out of her hands. Now the prosecutor, maybe sensing momentum shifting, lifted a photograph and held it for all to see. A shallow scrape ran across Officer Brennan's forearm, barely pink. This, she said, was the injury sustained by the officer in question during the encounter. Make no mistake, this is what started all of this. Leona didn't look away. Her eyes stayed locked on the photo, but it was her words that cut deeper. "That's all it takes to make me a monster?" she asked. One scratch. Stone didn't flinch. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "This court will not be manipulated by pity," he said flatly. Leona's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. "It's not pity," she said. "It's pain. You just can't tell the difference." And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. Because pain, when it's honest, doesn't shout. It doesn't have to. It just waits to be felt. And in that moment, even those who had sat unmoved for hours began to see that this wasn't about a child who acted out. It was about a system that never made room for her to exist gently. Her body was still small, but her truth filled the room. And Brennan? He looked down for the first time. Because sometimes even the ones who don't feel guilt can feel the heat of being watched. There was no warning, no shift in lighting, just the slow, quiet scrape of a chair sliding back and the sound of footsteps crossing the courtroom floor, measured firm, unshaken. The man in the gray shirt stepped into the center of the room. "I'm Victor Wells," he said simply. "Leona's legal guardian." There was a moment of pause, like the whole room forgot how to breathe. Flanagan was the first to snap. "Objection, Your Honor. This man is not listed on record. We have no documentation." Victor didn't look at her. He reached into his coat, calmly pulling out a thin black wallet. No theatrics, no rush, just the sound of aged leather unfolding. He held it out in one hand. Inside was a worn but unmistakable CIA badge, 20 years. Covert black operations, counterintelligence, 2 continents, 5 administrations. My record's sealed for a reason, but today I make an exception. Stone's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't give you the right to interrupt these proceedings." Victor's voice was calm, but it cut like glass. "I didn't come to interrupt. I came to finish what you refused to start the truth." He turned slightly facing the gallery, but his voice remained locked onto the bench. "You've all sat here listening to fragments, looking at this child like a problem that needs sorting. You asked what she did, how she moved, whether she spoke too loudly or fought too hard. But none of you ever asked who she is." He paused, then slowly turned to Leona. "She is my daughter." A sound escaped from Leona, something between a gasp and a whisper. "I thought you were dead." "I had to disappear," Victor answered, soft but firm. "But I never stopped watching." Brennan stirred, visibly sweating now. He muttered under his breath, barely audible, "Cairo, 2012. Victor's eyes didn't leave Leona. "You were 8 when I left. I carried your photo in places no cameras were allowed. They told me I couldn't have both a mission and a daughter, but they were wrong." Flanagan tried again, voice tighter this time. "Your Honor, this testimony isn't testimony." Victor snapped, eyes blazing now. "It's witness. You call this justice, a child brutalized in daylight then put on trial like a criminal, while every adult in her life stood silent." He walked toward the stand, not too close, but far enough that Stone could no longer look away. "You want to talk about order. You want to talk about facts. Here's a fact. Not one of you ever asked why a child would lash out unless she feared for her life. You didn't ask because you didn't see her as a child. You saw her as black and angry, and that was enough." Stone's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Victor's voice lowered, cold and deliberate. "The man who slammed her down knew who I was. Brennan recognized me. And he still did what he did because deep down, he didn't believe there would be consequences." His stare turned toward Brennan, who shifted in his seat, no longer pretending calm. "You wore that badge like it gave you power. I wore mine to make sure power didn't go unchecked." Victor took one final step forward, then stopped. "I'm not here to save face. I'm not here to demand special treatment. I'm here because silence has already cost my daughter too much. I'm here because every second I stayed quiet, she suffered in my place." Stone finally spoke, voice low, uncertain. "This doesn't change the facts of the case." Victor met his gaze without blinking. "No, Judge. It reveals the facts you refused to see." For a moment, the courtroom was completely still. No gavel, no sidebar, just the weight of a name none of them saw coming, and the unspoken truth that had finally walked into the room. Leona didn't move, but she looked up. And for the first time that day, someone was standing beside her, not to speak for her, but to say what needed to be said, because no one else had dared. Victor didn't speak when he stepped forward this time. He didn't need to. The silence that followed him was heavier than any outburst in that courtroom. In his hand was a small black USB drive. He placed it gently on the evidence table and spoke directly to the judge. "This," he said, his voice steady and precise, "is a direct copy of Officer Brennan's body cam footage. The original was deleted, but not before it passed through another set of eyes." Judge Stone frowned. "Mr. Wells, this courtroom is not the place for—" Victor cut in, not with volume but with certainty. "It is exactly the place." Flanagan stood to object, but stopped when the courtroom technician inserted the drive and the screen behind the judge lit up. The footage began to roll. Grainy at first, but then it sharpened and the sound hit like a slap. "Sit down, you little brat!" Brennan's voice boomed through the speakers. "You think you can talk back to me?" Leona was visible now, her backpack halfway off, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything. The footage didn't show her lashing out. It didn't show her fighting. What it showed was her flinching before he even touched her. It showed him grabbing her shoulder, twisting her around and slamming her against the ground. Gasps echoed across the room, and then the words. "You people always think you're victims," Brennan spat. "You're just born to be problems." Then, the most harrowing moment. He dragged her by the arm, and as she cried out, he shoved her head down her forehead, hitting the edge of the pavement. The screen went black. Nobody moved. Not Flanagan, not Judge Stone, not even the bailiff. The courtroom had turned to stone. Victor didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply turned to face the judge once more. "You wanted legal facts. That's one. That's your officer using language and force that don't belong to any badge." Flanagan stood slowly. "This footage, it might show excessive force, but it doesn't." Victor looked at her like a surgeon looks at a wound already bleeding too fast to stitch. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't reduce her pain to a policy error. That was a child." Leona sat still, but her eyes were locked on her father. Something in her face cracked open. "You didn't protect me then," she said just above a whisper. Victor turned. His jaw tightened, and for a moment even he looked unsure what to say. His voice came out quieter this time. "I couldn't. Not then." And then steadier. "But I'm here now." Stone cleared his throat. His voice, always so firm now, carried a tremble he couldn't hide. "This proves misconduct. It doesn't prove the girl's innocence." Victor didn't raise his voice, didn't even step forward. He simply met the judge's stare with something older than anger. Sometimes, he said, guilt is engineered, and innocence is buried. You know that. You've seen it before. Stone blinked the weight of the years behind his eyes, dragging his gaze toward Leona, toward the screen, toward the memory he could no longer control. Leona looked around the room then, slowly, not to cry, not to beg, just to be seen for once as something other than a file number or a courtroom burden. "I was 12, she said calmly. 12. I had homework in my backpack and crumbs in my pocket. But to him I looked like a threat." She paused. "And to all of you I was a case." Nobody said a word, because in that moment no one could. And the silence was finally hers. For a moment the courtroom stood still. Not a word, not a breath. Even the usual shuffle of legal documents had gone silent, as if everyone inside the chamber realized something had shifted. Something real, something irreversible. Prosecutor Flanagan cleared her throat. But this time there was no bite in her voice. No rigid defense of procedure or burden of proof, just a line quiet, almost ashamed. "Your Honor, the prosecution respectfully moves to drop all charges against the defendant." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Not a gasp, not applause, just the weight of dozens of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed, the footage, the brutality, the truth. Leona looked around the room. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched them. These adults who had dismissed her, discredited her, called her dangerous, trying to look anywhere except into her eyes. Judge Stone remained still behind the bench. His gavel rested on the polished wood beside him, untouched. For years he had used it to command silence, to reassert order, to remind everyone who held control in that room. But now, he simply stared. Not at the prosecutor, not at the defense. At the girl. And for the first time since the trial began, he didn't see a threat. He saw a child. Victor stepped forward slowly, as if not to startle the very silence he had helped create. His tone was calm, measured, but there was a power in it that didn't come from volume. "It shouldn't have taken this," he said, glancing at the screen still paused on the final frame of the body cam footage. "But sometimes it does." Flanagan looked down at her notes as if they might offer her shelter, but they didn't. Victor turned to face Judge Stone directly. "I don't want vengeance. I want accountability. And that begins with acknowledgement. You all looked at her and saw a disruption. But she was just trying to survive." Stone's fingers twitched at the edge of his bench. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't even try again. Victor didn't press. He just added with a slight incline of his head, "Not all power wears robes, Your Honor." Leona stood slowly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. All eyes turned to her again, but this time, no one saw a menace. No one reached for a radio. No one moved to silence her. She stepped forward, small hands still trembling slightly, and looked up at the bench that had loomed over her for the past week, like a fortress. "I didn't need to win," she said, voice clear. "I just needed to be heard." Stone blinked once. And in that blink was 1,000 unspoken reckonings. Cases dismissed too quickly, testimonies ignored, voices buried beneath the weight of technicalities. The bailiff approached Brennan, now seated rigidly beside his attorney. His face had lost its smugness. His badge, once proudly displayed on his chest, now looked like dead weight. "You're under internal review pending arrest," the bailiff said flatly, reaching for the cuffs. Brennan didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just lowered his head. And that silence wasn't justice, but it was the beginning of it. Clara Hayes reached over and gently touched Leona's shoulder. "You did more than survive," she whispered. "You changed the room." Victor didn't move toward his daughter yet. He stood back, giving her the space to stand tall without leaning on anyone. Leona looked at him, really looked. And in her eyes was not gratitude, not even relief. It was recognition. For the first time, she saw someone who wouldn't leave. Someone who had come back, not with noise or flash, but with the weight of truth. She whispered, barely audible, "I see you now." Victor smiled gently. "I never stopped seeing you." Behind them, the courtroom began to stir. The judge still hadn't called recess. No one moved to adjourn. It didn't feel like the end of a case. It felt like the end of something else entirely. An illusion, a belief, a wall that had finally cracked open. As they turned to leave, the air felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. And that was enough for now. The doors swung open slowly as Leona stepped outside. The light was softer now, filtered through the late afternoon haze. Her hands were still trembling slightly, fingers twitching from everything they had held in for so long, but her face was calm. Not blank, not numb, just still. As if for the first time in days, she was no longer bracing for impact. Victor followed behind her only a few steps away, yet it felt like he'd crossed miles to reach her. His walk was slower now, less guarded, and when he reached her side, he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He simply wrapped his arms around her tight, certain quiet. And she didn't flinch. She didn't hold back. She leaned in and let herself be held. 7 years of questions with no answers, of birthdays missed, of stories half told and never finished. And yet in that embrace, all the absence bent into a single moment of presence. Inside the courtroom, most people had already begun to gather their things. Some avoided eye contact with each other. Some lingered in their seats, not sure why they weren't moving. Judge Stone still hadn't left the bench. His gavel sat unused like it had all day, but he no longer looked at it like a symbol of order. He looked at it like a weight. Clara Hayes, still seated in the front row, turned to him. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence that remained, it carried. "We almost lost her." Stone didn't answer, but his eyes, tired and older than they had seemed hours earlier, followed the girl walking through the doors he once ordered her dragged into. Back outside, Leona looked up at her father. "Does this mean it's over?" she asked, her voice so quiet it might have been mistaken for wind. Victor shook his head. "No," he said gently, "but it means they had to see you. And that matters." She nodded, slowly, as if still trying to believe it. They walked down the steps together. No cameras, no crowd, just the sound of their footsteps and the echo of what had just taken place in that room behind them. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't promise anything, and still each step forward felt more certain than the one before it. A narrator's voice would have ruined it. A moral would have cheapened it. But if there was anything to be said, if there was anything to leave behind in that space, it was this. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She just stood. And sometimes that's how you win. This wasn't just a trial. It was a mirror. Not for her, but for them. For us. Because when a system forgets who it's meant to protect, sometimes it takes a child scared alone, underestimated, to remind it what justice is supposed to feel like. She wasn't saved. She survived. And in doing so, she changed the room.